In 1977, a man who had never carried a movie on his own stepped onto a low-budget film set in the dusty hills of Agoura, California. He was paid $5,000. The entire production was shot in just 11 days. The budget was $250,000, pocket change by Hollywood standards even back then. Critics would call the film shoddy. The New York Times would savage it as having wooden direction and a sophomoric cast. And none of that mattered. Because when the dust settled, that scrappy little trucker movie called Breaker Breaker had hauled in roughly $12 million at the box office. That is a return of nearly 50 times its budget. And the man standing at the center of it all, the man who threw the kicks, drove the rig, and convinced America that a karate champion could also be an action movie star, was Chuck Norris. But here is the part nobody talks about. Chuck Norris did not build his career on martial arts alone. He built it on a cultural wave that was sweeping the entire nation in the mid-1970s. A wave powered by a device that today most people under 40 have probably never even touched. The CB radio. The Citizens Band radio. That crackling, squawking box mounted on the dashboard of every 18-wheeler in America. And to understand how a karate champion from Oklahoma ended up starring in a trucker movie, you need to understand the absolutely wild story of how CB radios turned truck drivers into folk heroes, how a fuel crisis almost broke America, and how Hollywood scrambled to cash in on all of it. Let us start at the beginning. The 1970s did not begin kindly for the United States. The Vietnam War was dragging on. The counterculture hangover of the 1960s was giving way to a kind of weary cynicism. And then, in October of 1973, the bottom fell out. The Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, slapped an oil embargo on the United States and other nations that had supported Israel during the Yom Kippur War. Almost overnight, the price of oil skyrocketed. Gas stations started running dry. Long lines of cars snaked around city blocks with drivers waiting hours for a few gallons of fuel. The federal government responded by slashing the national speed limit to 55 miles per hour. Now, for ordinary drivers, this was an inconvenience. For truck drivers, it was an existential crisis. These were independent owner-operators, men who owned their own rigs and lived or died by the mile. A lower speed limit meant fewer miles covered per day. Higher fuel prices meant the cost of doing business was eating them alive, and many truck stops were simply running out of diesel entirely. So the truckers did something remarkable. They used the CB radios that had been quietly sitting in their cabs for years, and they organized. On December 3, 1973, a 37-year-old trucker from Overland Park, Kansas, used his CB to broadcast a call to action. He parked his rig across the lanes of an interstate highway and told every driver within range to do the same. Within days, truckers in at least 5 states had blocked highways with their massive 18-wheelers. It was a rolling rebellion, organized not by union bosses or politicians, but by regular working men talking to each other over Channel 19. The strikes escalated through late 1973 and into 1974. In Ohio, the governor deployed the National Guard, using tear gas to disperse the drivers. In Pennsylvania, the governor, himself a former coal truck driver, sat down with the strike leaders and promised to fight for more fuel allocations. By the time a tentative agreement was reached on February 7, 1974, the disruptions had caused around 100,000 layoffs and nationwide shortages of food and goods. Several people had died, but something else had happened too, something nobody predicted. The American public had fallen in love with truckers. Think about the timing. This was post-Watergate America, a country that had lost faith in its institutions, its politicians, its systems, And here were these rough, independent, blue-collar guys standing up to the oil companies and the government, using nothing but their guts and a radio. Truckers became the new cowboys. The open road became the new frontier, and the CB radio became the symbol of freedom. The numbers tell the story. In 1972, the Federal Communications Commission granted around 127,000 CB radio licenses. By 1975, that number had exploded to 1.7 million new licenses in a single year. In 1976, it hit 4.8 million. Between 1974 and 1977, an estimated 25 million CB radios were sold in the United States. Radio Shack, one of the biggest retailers of CB equipment, saw its profits double between 1973 and 1976. At the peak of the craze, roughly 1 in 5 American adults owned a CB radio. Even First Lady Betty Ford had one. Her handle was First Mama. And with the hardware came the language. CB slang was its own universe, a secret code that felt rebellious and cool and deeply American. Smokey, or bear, meant the police, a reference to the Smokey Bear hats worn by many highway patrol officers. Breaker Breaker was how you announced yourself on the channel. What's your 20 meant, where are you? A hammer lane was the fast lane. A lot lizard was, well, a colorful character you might encounter at a truck stop. 10-4, good buddy, meant, I hear you, friend. The whole thing was like a living, breathing subculture with its own rules, its own humor, and its own heroes. Hollywood naturally was paying attention, and this is where the story gets interesting. In late 1975, a novelty song called Convoy was released by an artist named C.W. McCall, who was actually an advertising executive from Iowa named Bill Fries. The song told the story of a massive trucker convoy barreling across the country, dodging Smokies and talking tough on the CB. It was loaded with CB slang, had a driving beat, and caught fire. Convoy hit #1 on both the Billboard country chart and the pop chart. It became one of the defining songs of the decade, and it proved something crucial to Hollywood. The American public was absolutely obsessed with truckers and CB radios and was willing to pay money for entertainment that featured them. The floodgates opened. In 1977 alone, multiple trucker-themed projects hit screens across the country. But 2 films stood above the rest, and they could not have been more different. The first was Smokey and the Bandit, directed by stuntman-turned-filmmaker Hal Needham, and starring Burt Reynolds at the absolute peak of his charm. It was a big-budget studio comedy with car chases, CB banter, Jackie Gleason chewing scenery as a bumbling sheriff, and Jerry Reed singing Eastbound and Down. The movie was a colossal hit, earning $127 million domestically and becoming the second highest-grossing film of 1977, behind only a little space opera called Star Wars. The second trucker film of 1977 was a very different animal. It had no big studio behind it. It had no established movie stars. It had a budget that would barely cover the catering on a Burt Reynolds set. It was called Breaker Breaker, and its star was a 40-year-old karate champion who had never carried a movie before. To understand why Chuck Norris ended up in a trucker movie, you need to understand his journey up to that point, because it is one of the most unlikely career arcs in Hollywood history. Carlos Ray Norris was born on March 10, 1940, in Ryan, Oklahoma, a tiny town that was barely a dot on the map. His childhood was rough. His father, Ray D. Norris, was a World War II veteran who struggled with alcoholism. He would disappear on drinking binges that lasted for months. The family bounced around: Oklahoma, Kansas, eventually California. Young Chuck, as he would come to be called, was shy, non-athletic, and a mediocre student. Nothing about him suggested future stardom of any kind. After graduating from high school, Norris joined the United States Air Force in 1958. He was stationed at Osan Air Base in South Korea, and it was there that everything changed. Norris began training in Tang Soo Do, a Korean martial art, and discovered a talent and a passion that would define his life. He earned the nickname Chuck from his fellow servicemen, and he brought his new obsession back to the States when he was discharged in 1962. What happened next was a slow, methodical climb that tells you everything about Chuck Norris's character. He lost his first 2 competitive bouts. He lost again. He kept coming back. He worked at Northrop Corporation during the day and taught karate at night, eventually opening a chain of martial arts studios in the Los Angeles area. His students included some surprising names: Steve McQueen, Priscilla Presley, Bob Barker, Donnie and Marie Osmond. By the late 1960s, Norris had transformed himself into one of the most dominant karate fighters in America. In 1968, he won the Professional Middleweight Karate Championship, a title he would hold for 6 consecutive years. His competitive record was extraordinary: 183 wins, 10 losses, and 2 draws. In 1969, he won karate's Triple Crown for the most tournament victories in a single year and was named Fighter of the Year by Black Belt magazine. He was, without question, one of the greatest martial artists the United States had ever produced. But Norris wanted more, and the push toward Hollywood came from 2 of the biggest names in the business. The first was Bruce Lee. Norris and Lee met in 1967 at a martial arts tournament, and they became friends and training partners. In 1972, Lee invited Norris to play the main villain in his film The Way of the Dragon. Their fight scene in the Roman Colosseum is still considered one of the greatest martial arts sequences ever filmed. The film was a massive hit, especially in Asia, and it put Chuck Norris on the map as a screen presence. But it was someone else who told Norris he could be more than just a villain. Steve McQueen, the king of cool himself, was one of Norris's karate students. McQueen saw something in his teacher that went beyond fighting ability. In 1974, he told Norris flat out that he should pursue acting seriously and encouraged him to take acting classes at MGM. Norris was skeptical. He was a fighter, not a performer. He was shy by nature, the product of a difficult childhood. But McQueen's words stuck. Norris took a few small roles. He played a villain in a low-budget kung fu film. He wrote a book on tournament karate. And then, in 1977, an opportunity landed on his desk that would change everything. It was a script for a low-budget trucker movie called Breaker Breaker, and it was perfectly timed to ride the CB radio craze that was consuming America. Now, Norris could have easily dismissed this project. He had been offered several martial arts films and turned them all down. He later explained that he wanted to do films that had a real story, where the action happened when it was emotionally right, not just wall-to-wall kung fu fighting. Breaker Breaker offered him something different. It was an action movie, sure, but it had a narrative hook, a trucker searching for his missing brother in a corrupt small town, and it put Norris in the driver's seat, literally and figuratively. The film was produced by Paragon Films and distributed by American International Pictures, or AIP, the legendary exploitation studio that had been pumping out drive-in movies for decades. AIP knew exactly what it was doing. The CB radio craze was at its absolute peak. Trucker culture was the hottest commodity in entertainment. And here was a genuine world karate champion who could throw a real kick and look good doing it. The production was bare bones. Director Don Hewlett shot the entire film in just 11 days at Paramount Ranch in Agoura, California, the same historic location where countless westerns had been filmed over the decades. Norris was paid a total of $5,000. He later admitted, "I didn't know anything when I made that movie." But the rawness was part of its charm. In Breaker Breaker, Norris plays J.D. Dawes, a California trucker whose younger brother Billy starts working as a driver and disappears after being lured into a trap by corrupt law enforcement in a fictional town called Texas City. J.D. rolls into town, asks questions the locals do not want to hear, throws devastating kicks at anyone who stands in his way, and ultimately rallies a convoy of fellow truckers to tear the corrupt town apart, literally driving their big rigs through buildings. The film is soaked in CB culture. Characters communicate over Channel 19. CB slang peppers nearly every conversation. The truckers are portrayed as loyal, tough, working-class heroes, exactly how America wanted to see them in 1977. And at the center of it all, Norris brought a quiet, physical intensity that was unlike anything audiences had seen from an American action star. Here is something most people do not know about this film. The cast included an actor named Jack Nance, who played a character named Burton. That same year, 1977, Nance would star as the lead in David Lynch's surreal masterpiece, Eraserhead. It is hard to imagine two more different films being connected by a single actor. But that was the wild ecosystem of low-budget filmmaking in the 1970s. And here's another remarkable detail. The film's editor was a young man named Steven Zaillian. At the time, Zaillian was just starting out, cutting low-budget action movies to pay the bills. He would go on to become one of the most acclaimed screenwriters in Hollywood history, winning an Academy Award for his screenplay for Schindler's List in 1993. He also wrote or co-wrote the scripts for Awakenings, Gangs of New York, The Irishman, and many other celebrated films. So Breaker Breaker holds a strange distinction. It is the film where the future Oscar-winning screenwriter of Schindler's List learned his craft in the editing room by cutting together Chuck Norris's roundhouse kicks. When Breaker Breaker was released on May 6, 1977, it did not exactly set the critics' world on fire. The New York Times called it shoddy with wooden direction. The Los Angeles Times labeled it a talky, melodramatic exploitation hybrid. But the audiences who packed into drive-in theaters and downtown cinemas across America did not care about critics. They came for the trucks, the CB radios, the fights, and the sheer escapist fun of watching a strong, silent man deliver justice with his fists. And they came in droves. The film grossed approximately $12 million against its $250,000 budget. That is a 48-to-1 return on investment. In Hollywood, those are the kinds of numbers that change careers. Norris himself was not particularly proud of the film. Years later, in 1981, he acknowledged its roughness, but noted that it was his father's favorite of all his movies, and that it made a lot of money. That second part was what mattered in Hollywood, because in the film business, nothing succeeds like success. Breaker Breaker proved something fundamental. Chuck Norris could carry a movie. Not as a sidekick, not as a villain getting beaten up by Bruce Lee, but as the star, the man whose name goes above the title. And Hollywood took notice. The following year, in 1978, Norris starred in Good Guys Wear Black, which he considered his first truly significant lead role. The film had an interesting distribution story. No studio wanted to release it, so Norris and his producers adopted a strategy called four-walling. They rented the theaters themselves and kept whatever money came in. The gamble paid off spectacularly. Shot on a $1 million budget, Good Guys Wear Black earned over $18 million at the box office. Now the trajectory was set. In 1979, A Force of One earned $20 million. In 1980, The Octagon made almost $19 million. In 1983, Lone Wolf McQuade, in which Norris played a reckless Texas Ranger, became a worldwide hit. The great film critic Roger Ebert gave it 3.5 stars and predicted that the character of J.J. McQuade was worthy of a film series. Ebert was more right than he knew. Lone Wolf McQuade directly inspired the creation of Walker, Texas Ranger, the CBS television series that ran from 1993 to 2001, made Norris a household name across the globe, and generated over $500 million in total revenue for the Norris brand by the early 1990s. But that path, from Walker, Texas Ranger to The Expendables 2, from internet memes to the status of genuine American cultural icon, all of it traces back to a single moment. The moment when a former Air Force airman from Oklahoma, who had reinvented himself as a karate champion, reinvented himself again by climbing into the cab of a big rig and talking into a CB radio for a movie that cost less than a house in the suburbs. What makes the story of Breaker Breaker so fascinating is how perfectly it sits at the intersection of multiple cultural forces. The CB radio craze was not just about gadgets. It was about communication, about community, about ordinary people connecting with each other outside the control of corporations and governments. In a sense, CB radio was the social media of the 1970s. It was decentralized, anarchic, democratic, and wildly popular. And just like social media decades later, it spawned its own celebrities, its own language, its own culture, and its own entertainment industry. The trucker movies of the late 1970s were not high art, but they were something arguably more important in the history of American cinema. They were populist. They spoke to an audience that felt overlooked by mainstream Hollywood. Blue-collar workers, rural Americans, people who drove trucks or fixed cars or worked with their hands. These were the people who packed the drive-ins and the second-run theaters, and they wanted to see themselves on screen. Tough, independent, free. Chuck Norris understood this audience instinctively because he was one of them. He grew up poor. He grew up overlooked. He built everything he had through relentless effort and an almost irrational refusal to quit. When he stood in front of the camera as J.D. Dawes, he was not acting tough. He was tough, and audiences could feel it. The broader cultural moment deserves attention too. The year 1977 was one of the most extraordinary years in the history of cinema. Star Wars redefined blockbuster filmmaking. Saturday Night Fever captured the disco era. Close Encounters of the Third Kind brought science fiction into the mainstream. Annie Hall won Best Picture. And tucked in among all these landmarks, a wave of trucker films rode the CB radio phenomenon into theaters across the country. Smokey and the Bandit became a cultural touchstone. Breaker Breaker launched an action legend. The trucker movie genre, brief as it was, left a permanent mark on Hollywood. The CB radio craze did not last. By the late 1970s, the channels were overcrowded. The FCC expanded the available frequencies from 23 to 40 in 1977, and the novelty began to wear off. The 1980s brought cellular phones and eventually the internet, and the CB faded from mainstream culture. But it never disappeared entirely from trucking. To this day, professional drivers still use Channel 19 to share information about road conditions, accidents, and yes, speed traps. And the legacy of that era lives on in ways most people do not realize. Every time you see an action movie starring a regular guy who takes on corrupt authority through sheer grit and physical skill, you are seeing the DNA of the trucker movie genre. Every time you hear someone say, 10-4, you are hearing an echo of the CB revolution. And every time someone makes a Chuck Norris joke, Chuck Norris doesn't read books, he stares them down until he gets the information he wants. They are participating in a cultural mythology that began, in a very real sense, when a quiet, determined man climbed into a truck for an 11-day shoot on a dusty ranch in California. Chuck Norris passed away on March 19, 2026, at the age of 86 in Hawaii. The outpouring of tributes from fans, fellow actors, martial artists, military veterans, and ordinary people around the world was a testament to the extraordinary life he lived. From a shy kid in Oklahoma to an Air Force airman in Korea, From a martial arts champion to a Hollywood leading man, from a TV icon to an internet legend, his journey is one of the most remarkable in American entertainment history. And it all started with a $250,000 trucker movie, a CB radio, and $5,000. Breaker, breaker. That's a big 10-4.